Hello, folks. I think this is episode 9 of our platform thinking and design podcast, YouTube channel thingy. Today, I'm really excited to hang out with my friend, Marc Burgauer. My birthday. So this is my early birthday present, is getting to talk to Marc for an hour or so. And I hope everybody else enjoys the conversation as well. We're going to talk about some social practice theory, some platform stuff, and some other topics that Marc and I like to bat around. And I think it's going to be a fun conversation. Hey, Marc, do you want to introduce yourself to everybody and kind of say hi?
I'm having an echo of yours.
Oh, good. Do you have the YouTube open in the background?
I still hear you. I have my own echo.
I'm not getting an echo, but do you have YouTube open by any chance in another window? I do that every single time. Hilarious. I didn't do it this time though.
I'm so sorry.
It's all good.
Cool. When we come back. I'm so sorry, but that was too weird. First thing, two Jabes and plenty Jabe and me. And I think you wanted me to introduce myself.
Yes, please.
You wrote a lovely bio of me on LinkedIn. I'm just going to go quickly over it if people want the detail. That's where you find it. I started out as a biologist, studied biology. That got me into complexity theory. But somehow my academic environment wasn't quite conducive to my nature at the time. There was also the opportunity. I learned programming as a teenager, thanks to a rich friend. There were opportunities to still make a little money early days when PCs came out. So I got into IT. Did IT in terms of like little things here and there, little, small scale of developments, mostly database-based stuff for a while. Then I met my wife. We moved to Scotland. That was just about when the internet started to become a thing. And I dabbled into, hey, I want to do databases on the internet. And at that time, you more or less had to cobble it all together yourself, But there wasn't a CGI bin. There wasn't even Perl at that time. But wrote content management in 1999, 98, 99. We started a company, sold it to local agencies in Scotland, did bus timetables for biggest, I think, at least in Scotland, one of the biggest bus companies before anybody else did bus timetables on the internet. So, so in a sense, when we talk about platforms,
yeah,
we always had to learn how to build, and always when you're early in a field where you start to build, when you start trying new technology stuff, then you gain a sort of an experience that you don't gain elsewhere. So, didn't get the business experience that I was looking for. So we did this for 8 years until the sort of thing that we did with programmers ourselves became more a commodity. So something like Drupal came along. So we also started from the beginning as an agile shop. So just 98, 99 was also, I think, when the first extreme programming website came up and people were talking, and already intuitively in the sense of where I'm now, but back then more intuitively sort of say, yeah, that seems promising. So we ran the company following basically XP or Agile principles and just adapted the principle as and when we say, okay, Agile doesn't explain this, or not all of Agile's principles quite apply here, but the idea basically of try figure out whether you're on the right track early. Yeah, so it's then the golden thread. So what's the smallest thing that could possibly work? Not because, hey, then we could make money, but because then you find out how wrong you are.
Yeah.
So if people want to work as an agile coach, that is maybe the core principle that I still upheld, and I think it's a thread that goes through everything. So whatever I do. So then I went after the business became obsolete, so to speak. We did a few pivots in how we could use the technology that we had so we did community platforms and stuff before anybody talked about community platforms, etc. But we wouldn't have to do another pivot at the time, and both my wife and I, who ran the company together, we decided we wanted to do different things. So I then went and did a large-scale digital transformation before we talked about digital transformation, which also meant like when the work came, it took me a while. Oh, you mean the thing that I've been doing for the last 5 years or so?
Right.
Took me a while to understand what that thing is. with the NHS. That's the health service in Scotland. Again, so I was hired. My boss said from day one, don't do anything agile. I tried this doesn't work. But of course, I just did it undercover. So I was the lead project manager for the technical aspects of this transformation. And the only way you succeed, the reason I succeeded was I did all what I learned from my agile experience. I did it undercover, so to speak. I just changed all the labels. I wouldn't call things. I didn't call it a stand-up, and I didn't call it a retro, and I didn't call it a backlog. But the principles were still done: collaborative, find the right stakeholders, work with customers close, etc. Blah 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 blah. At which point, there was always a reluctance for me to call myself an agile coach. But at the point when I was ready to leave that job, because challenge was done, it worked. It would have just been endless improvement, and I wasn't that interested. I respected Agile Coach in Scotland basically said, you are an agile coach. So that's when I entered agile coaching proper, so to speak. And I've been in various companies since, well, what was that now? 7-8 years, until I came across practice theory, which we're going to talk about.
Cool. So, you kind of described like a community platform, but I like that, like with most of the guests, to like help people. I mean, there's so many different definitions of platform. So like to ground our conversations, to like help people understand what we're going to talk about today, at least. How would you define a platform? Like what was a platform for you, or in this conversation we're going to have? How would you think about it?
So there's two answers to that. So the first thing I would like, so I'll listen to a lot of your previous episodes, and I think the golden thread through it is everybody actually has this notion of it's a structure to stand on. Yeah.
Yep.
And either you're part of the structure itself,
yep,
or you're standing on. But when we think of a platform, there's this hard, so you wait on a platform for a train. You don't think about like, okay, so people came here and they built this and they had to, carve it out so next to the track. So you're oblivious to what was needed for that to happen.
Right.
And in that regard, for example, as a user of a platform, that's probably right. I don't want to know how that happened. But when you stand on the platform at a train station, you also don't think like, yeah, but that also needs maintenance. Yeah. So because it's mostly some kind of concrete and so on, and decays very slowly, and
right.
It's not likely even, in a noticeable period to change. But if you start looking at material as part of, like in process philosophy, where material is just a substance that sort of, I say, condensates as part of the process, then you start to think about these things differently. So what I would like people to think about a platform is a membrane.
Right.
So this is a biological principle. How does nature create an inside and an outside? And what's the advantage of actually having an inside? And if we think about platform, who's the inside, who's the outside? If we just look at it as a membrane, what inside and outside is not so important. But when I started thinking the thing through, I thought, actually, okay, so in nature, why nature creates membranes, insides, is to create protected environments in which things suddenly become possible for the organism that exposed to the environment fully exposed to the environment wouldn't be possible. Yeah, so there's, you understand, there's a constraint, and it enables new face space where that wasn't there before. And if we think about a platform that way, then the users are on the insides, because that's who you want to enable different things for. Yeah. And the platform providers, so to speak, they're on the outside. They have to deal with the environment and the impacts of the environment in order to create that protected space for the inside.
Right.
So if we go a bit away from the inside and outside, then a platform is basically a membrane that facilitates transactions between practices that happen on the inside and practices that happen on the outside. And the important thing to understand also in that is you need to understand the practices on both sides in order to know what kind of membrane you need. Right. And you need to be aware that the practices that were on one side wouldn't survive on the other side. There's different set of practices, but yet the success of a platform is, can you connect them? Right. Can you connect these practices through the mediation of the membrane, the platform?
Yeah. Interesting.
So that gives you maybe a definition from biological point of view, but also some characteristics that we should think about when we design platforms.
Yeah. So I was actually I was at DDD Europe last week, 2 weeks ago, last week. Anyway, and I was talking about the same thing, roughly same space, and the rough thing I was trying to say, which I think is similar to what you're saying, especially if we think of it kind of biological membranes in particular. The system theoretic of a platform ends up taking what you're saying and meaning that it's a closed, like we're trying to create a closed system. There's a closed inside, protected from the outside. Whereas I think if we think from more of a complexity theory perspective or from a biologic perspective, what we're saying is that you have to define a boundary that does a couple things. One of them is it creates a certain level of order that is kind of more ordered than complete chaos, but not so ordered as to be completely stable, kind of from a dissipative theory kind of perspective, right? Like if we make the system completely mechanistic, it will tend to break down, right? We want some of the chaos to flow through it. That's kind of how the innovation and the adaptation happens. It can't be completely isolated from the environment. It's kind of be open a little bit, but also that because it's an artificial system, it's not a natural system, we can choose to where to put the boundary and how to negotiate across the boundary. Is kind of we have more choices about that. And so I was actually trying to argue that a boundary is almost like an attractor in this way. Like you put the boundary in a place that encourages interaction between the separate parts of the system, right? Like it's not just arbitrary. It's actually there, especially in a platforming perspective, to encourage people to interact with it, to pass things through the membrane as you were describing it. So when we think about that, and again, I tend to think of cell membranes and things like this as being semi-permeable. They're not rigid. They're not it's not a bottle, right? It's not like an inside outside with a rigid system around it. It's a membrane where things can flow across it. And I think that's kind of a more interesting version of what you mean. Does that make sense?
Okay, so that's why I chose the metaphor of a membrane. So first of all, a membrane also behaves differently depending what it interacts with. Your skin has different states, yeah, right. And that is it can respond to cold, hot weather, wet, etc., dry. So it has self-healing. It has, so it is a living thing in itself. So physiologically, we talk about an organ, yeah, when we talk about the skin, and so that's what I mean. But also, in a sense, when we make choices about our platform, so Simone talked about the bifurcation, and so what it means essentially, there are several points in your platform evolution where you actually have to make a choice, which way you want. Or when you talk about your decomposable platform, so initially you have a rigid thing in terms of maybe early adoption to have a customers, and so you want to make it the easiest possible, but that means you have to be, I think you guys called it editorial. But then you want to get to the thing also as you start to get to know your customer mature in this interaction, then you also want to give them more options. Right. And so you have to be responsive. So equally, a membrane has that in it. So yes, it's permeable, but it's very selective about what it lets in and out. So it gives you, as a platform owner, it gives you control, but equally the control is only as good as, so especially then we think about the users actually are on the inside. So you have to make sure the right stuff gets in. So the users won't die, they just go elsewhere, but the practices that you actually try to nurture inside your platform or on top of your platform, whichever way you want to look at it. If what I could do with your platform is simplistic, then there's a business, somebody will come and reverse engineer it. Yeah. And they might have economies of scale that, especially if you're in a startup, you don't have. So it's one of the things you learn as a startup. It's okay, so we've proven that here's a business case, and now actually, here come the copycats that have a few millions to throw at it, and in no time, they copy your features that took you a lot of time to discover. Yeah. Right. So having these various options and as I said, so in your previous episode, Charlie went deep on actually how strong this. It's not just bifurcation. There's lots of branching and lots of options. Being very conscious or present when you make these choices, that you understand why you're doing it, etc., is very important.
Yeah.
Again, which for me works with the metaphor of a membrane, because it responds to the context.
Yeah. I also like one of the things. So like I was kind of for a while I was obsessed with this term organ and organized and organization, and like why are these things like all why are these things all kind of the same type of thing? And like one of the things that I kind of eventually kind of arrived at least in my mind, is that so like in Agile, we have a little bit of it. Like we can differentiate and be clear that there's a difference between individual contributors and a team. So a team is an organ. It's an organizational structure. It's not a bunch of individual cells. And in fact, our bodies are like that too, right? We're not just a big pile of cells. We are cells that are organized into separate functions. Those functions are held by different organs. And they're specialized in doing specific things in order to, but they're all interrelated too, right? Like your respiration and your heart rate and your, muscular system, these are all like interrelated and kind of modulating each other. So they're not separate from each other, but at the same time, there is some sort of structure that's happening there that's not like completely homogenized. There's some heterogeneity in there. And I think to me that like, it's one of the things I think about when I think about a platform is that we're getting to this kind of like level of, I mean, if we want to use kind of biological terms of evolution, where there's more and more pressure to kind of develop these other structures in our organization to kind of manage this complexity at a different level. And maybe that like these new organs are the platforms that are arriving or something like that.
Yeah. That is an apt observation. Okay, so just let's backtrack a bit. So when you say we have this confusion about organization and organizing and organigrams and for a process philosopher, it all comes from what's happening. Yeah. So then also if we look at structures, then we see structures as an outcome of processes, and when these structures become more articulated, more pronounced, like in an organ, then that's because they are very long-lived, very resilient, very also confirmed, validated processes. So if we're talking about complexity, there's lots of constraints regimes that came together and they keep it also in place. And then this is self-reinforcing, then the specialization gives increasing benefits to a point. But so we also know that in the body, early understandings was, so these organs, they are so specialized and they do everything that so everything happens in the organ that the organ is specialized for. So like you're breathing only through the lungs. Yeah. There's no other way to get O2 into your body other than the lungs. And then a little later we'll find out, actually you're also breathing through your skin. And there's absorption in many levels. It's just like the bulk of it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And that's also a good way to think about how do you identify which structures you need in an organization. So what are you doing so often and so much of, need so much of it, that it's actually worth having a specialization, having a dedicated team. You talk with Mario about security teams, and that actually having security teams that have the ability to work with the people in, let's say, development teams or ops, etc. That is like an organ, because you say the organs in the body are all interconnected, and they are, because organs respond to stuff that might happen just somewhere in the periphery of your body. So there's messengers stuff going on, so they know, okay, so somewhere in the body we need a bit more of this right now, so let's pump it in the blood so it can get there, and then it gets absorbed, and now the levels are down again. Okay, well, all of this responsiveness. So if we think about structuring of an organization as a process, and at which point some structures become clear, and we're focusing our processes on needs, what is needed in order to create value, but also create safety and resilience and stuff like that, rather than going with, here's a blueprint, just copy that. we're more likely actually to creating the right kind of structures that help us achieve our goals.
Yep.
So organs, if we take it literally in how we see physiologically working, then that's the right point.
Yeah. So
shift left from that.
But let's talk a little bit about like constraint regimes a little bit. Because like there's some tricky things that we're saying subtly here that I want to make sure we kind of bring out a little bit, right? And so like one of my favorite kind of versions of this in kind of this way that we're talking about kind of evolution or development of systems and things like this is kind of the complexity view of like learning to walk. So like the traditional kind of view or like the naive view is like babies are born and somehow they have something in their brain and then or they're given something that goes into their brain and that's how they learn how to walk, and it's like almost all an idea. They're taught it somehow. So it's conceptual or it's in their brain or something like that. Whereas a complexity theorist would be like, oh no, like legs only work in a certain kind of way. So the way you learn to walk is you use your legs in the ways that they're usable. And then there's a certain phase space that's created by that, oh, this is a useful way to use the things that work in these ways. So that it's not like your legs are the organs are pre-structured or a set of constraints, but walking is emergent from those constraints. It's not prior to the constraints, right? It's like it's not like you have this idea of walking or that walking occurs. It's that you have legs and therefore walking occurs, right? Like it emerges from the constraint regimes. So like how define this idea of a constraint and then what a constraint regime is, because I think to me then that's starts being related to these ideas about social practice and nexus. Is these are other terms that I think are interrelated there. So let's start with constraint and regime and constraint regime though. Like what should people know about those things?
Okay, so to explain this fully would probably take about 3 hours or so, and to really understand it might take you a while. Actually, start looking at the world through that idea.
Yeah.
But basically, let's go with how you explain how you learn to walk. Let's stay with that for a minute. So what you say is, okay, so we're born with legs. And because they're legs and not tentacles or wheels or something, the physical shape already gives us some constraints about what movements are possible, what movements are not possible. But we don't just have the mechanics of legs, so the bones and the muscles. We also have nerves, etc. So as we interact with the environment, let's say grounds, softer, harder, and gravity, and blah, 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 we get feedback all the time, yeah? So I'm not sure if that's really how babies learn how to walk, but my guess is they see other humans walk, yeah? So from one side, they get some notion of how do beings like myself move, yeah? And so there's maybe some mimicry, but the way they learn it then is essentially they interact with the environment. So they're using the restrictions of legs, etc., and the constraints. So some constraints are your muscles and your bones and gravity and grounds and stuff like that. But then you also have you have the feedback loop from here's what you feel and does that look right? Does that feel right? Am I actually moving forward? And how stable and fast is that, comfortable, etc. So we could see this as the enabling constraint, yeah. But then as soon as we're actually starting to understand the space of movements that are possible with these two things at our lower body, and we suddenly see, oh, here's things that work, yeah, and with muscle memory, etc. So the body also then remembers, yeah, if I want to do that, I don't need to think it through, or I need to, respond to all of the experience like I did the first time. So okay, so I'm not sure. I never seen actually. I haven't had kids, so I don't know really whether what I'm saying is true, but it is true in my experience learning how to ride a bike. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And we have this little model that we say, so you're a bit more conscious about in your initial learning, and then once you get good at it, become less conscious. I don't think conscious always has to be rational, analytical process. It could just like say being aware in the moment, etc. I think babies can do that. But once you learn, you see this seems to work. This seems to achieve what I want to do. Then there's a stabilizing effect comes in. So the first few constraints that I could talk about, they're bottom-up enabling constraints. Yeah, we call them this.
So like the way that your legs are able to do certain things is an enabling constraint.
Yeah, but it's important for an enabling constraint that there's also the feedback, that it can respond to feedback. Yeah, so if there's, it's one of the things people get, I'm not so upset anymore that people often get wrong when they talk about enabling constraints, because they just intuitively go, oh, I feel enabled by this constraint.
Right. Yep.
And we can maybe just quickly later talk about what is a governor or top-down or context-insensitive constraint, especially because, okay, so there's the whole spectrum. If you really want to understand the whole spectrum of constraints, Alicia's new book that just came out yesterday will be a delight, I'm sure. But essentially, initially, you have to have bottom-up constraints. They make certain things possible, but in themselves, they would not get you to a capability, to something that is reproducible. Yeah, there needs to be something that also have a stabilizing effect. And so, but the stabilizing is constituted by the integration of the bottom-up effects. Yeah. So when they integrate lightly, then Alicia calls it constraint satisfaction and constraint closure. Yeah. Then when that happens, that has a stabilizing effect, and suddenly you have like a new system.
Yep.
And the stabilizing thing then constrains. So your experience of successful walking makes it harder to actually mimic bad walking. Yeah, which is why we laugh when we see Monty Python silly walks, because we also know actually walking like they do, that is almost hard, because now we have the stabilizing constraint of in our experience that's not how you walk.
Yeah.
Your body knows that's not how you walk. Hey, no, walking is this is the stabilizing effect. And that's the other thing that people often don't understand, is that the best governing constraints are constituted by the right kind of the closure of bottom-up constraints. And so if they don't have feedback loop, you never get. If there's nothing with feedback, you never get closure. Yeah. That never happens, because the feedback at some point locks the bottom-up constraints in, and then the stabilizing constraint sort of emerges, so to speak, out of it. Or it's easier to explain actually if we were going chemistry or stuff like that, but that would take too long. And so the top-down constraint is the stabilizing effect that you didn't see. And so when we're talking constraint regimes, is when we see a bunch of these things happening together and so interacting. Yeah, so it's not just two bottom-up constraints and one top-down, but it's sometimes like a little cascade. So there's a good example in what's it called, Biological Autonomy, from Mossio and Moreno, I think, where they show there's a series of interactions. Yeah, so when we go to pre-Eugene, what is autopoiesis? The key of autopoiesis is that the reaction actually reproduces the catalyst that it needs to happen. Yeah.
Yep.
So, in a sense, that's a little bit of constrained closure. But we get to self-reproducing organisms. There is a lot more complexity of such constrained closures interacting with each other. So then you have suddenly a multi-step of these. So that's what they show in the book. You have suddenly multiple steps in which several catalysts have to be produced, and the more interaction complexity you get, the more diversity you get. So that's what I mean. And just to be clear, what is a top-down governing constraint in the sense of a context-insensitive constraint? Because sometimes top-down constraint can also be context. But what I often see people talk about when they mean enabling constraint is, let's say you are a painter, yeah? And you just decide, I'm going to do a painting with 3 colors, yeah? So there are painters that will tell you this enabled them to create a vision, a language, a coherence in their expression, etc. That wouldn't have happened if they didn't constrain their choices. Yeah, in music, you constrain your choices all the time. You try to keep a rhythm, or you try to keep a key, etc. But the result is like there's an experience that if I would just throw a wall of arbitrary noise chaos at you, nobody would have that experience. Not the performer, not the listener. Yeah, the reduction, the deliberate choice of constraints can enable us, yeah?
Right.
But more in the sense of it focuses on attention. It makes certain things more likely. Like if you stick to a major key, you will be more likely harmonic than if you suddenly use 12-tone scales, etc. Yeah, then it's much harder to have this experience of harmony. Let's say if you listen to Mozart, harmony is all you get it all the time. You get tensions in harmony, but it is a relatively it's we have now applications that write Mozart-like music. Like so, at some point, there is an understanding there's a coherence that is reproducible, which is much harder if you go. What was it? Quarter tone music was one of the things I pursued a little bit at one point. The reason I didn't stick with it was like I didn't get it. I never got to that. This sounds like coherent. I didn't have the experience, but I listened to talented composer stuff. I had that experience, which is why I got interested. But that also means my experience didn't lead me to those constraint regimes. My experience has led me to other constraint regimes.
Yeah, interesting.
So you then look at nature and everything that you build actually as a constraint regime. So that's, again, just I want to tie it back just so people understand. It's process philosophy. Yeah. It's the interactions are what the things make happen, yeah? So this is why Alicia says, meaning exists in the interaction of things, not the things themselves.
Right, yeah. So
referencing Alicia Fornero, just for people who don't know.
Yes. Dynamics in Action is her
Context
first book.
Changes Everything is out since yesterday, yes. Yep.
It's my other birthday present to myself is starting to read that again. So there's a couple things that makes me think about. So the first one that I tend to think about is which a more practical version first, which is I like to think through platform thinking with these tools by basically suggesting that there would be two ways to think about developing a platform. One way would be you go off in a room and develop an API, and then you publish the API and insist that people have to use the platform through that API. And that's the way that and this, I think, is your governing constraints or your top-down constraints or your context-free constraint, right? It's not responsive to the context. It's not responsive to the people that are working on top of the platform, right? Or within the platform in your metaphor, the boundary is being enforced on them. It's not supporting them in some way. Whereas kind of the term that I like to use to describe kind of the relationship between these bottom up and top down is mereological recursion. There's a kind of iteration that's happening between the levels, right? So that if we thought about a platform that way, you'd first think about publishing, assembling some set of capabilities that you think would be desirable, right? Like some set of things that a team might, or a set of teams in your organization might want to use. So let's say we're going to integrate a security system and a logging system and some other things into something, but you would publish it in a way that you would be primarily interested in attracting people to use it. And you wouldn't think of it as being stable when you first published it, because what you would think of is that what will stabilize it is its use by the organization. What will cause the API to stabilize is that people will start to use it. And then when you have multiple teams working on the API at the same time, putting pressure on it, that is the top-down pressure that will stabilize the system in a way that's more dynamic and responsive, as opposed to static and pre-thought or pre-done. And it seems like that should have some benefits to it if you kind of think through a complexity lens. Is that how would you think through that? Does that make sense to you, or is that would you think it through a different way?
No, I think you're pointing out the right thing. If I look puzzled, it was am I following you? Am I always sure that the teams that are using the packer are just a governing constraint? I'm not sure that's true. But the important point is that you started with the metaphor of the Avery Tower API. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, often that's how. So when I maybe should also do the disclaimer here that I'm not building platforms. I just happen to work with teams who build platforms, and so some of the technology I have no aspiration to keep up with and understand. And you had good episodes before to explain that, so we don't need to go there. But often what you see when people start saying, hey, we want to do a platform, then first of all, they believe it's a problem, it's a solution to a problem they already have and don't know how to solve otherwise. And that's usually already my thing. You might not succeed with a platform. And somebody said, I can't remember who, but somebody said most platform projects actually still go and die. They don't work, they don't take off. And my hunch is most of them come from that sort of thinking. So this is something that we're partially guilty of as people who have worked in computers since they became abundant. But they can help us with every problem. And that's only partially true. This is only partially true. It's only true when we understand the problem. Once we understand the problem, then computers can help us scale the solution. But the solution itself is never the technology first. It's some sort of understanding of interaction, understanding of constraint regimes. And I'm not saying actually everybody has to go and study the constraint language, because people intuitively understand this actually quite well, even without understanding the whole theory. It's just nice, hey, there is a theory. And sometimes it helps you focus your attention, knowing what the theory sort of instruct. So even the Ivory API architect sooner or later will actually be forced to acknowledge feedback. Then that's the budget. Totally. I mean, if he doesn't care how his thing is used, as long as it's used, sooner or later he will hit economic problems. So there are some environmental influences that nobody ever can, escape permanently. Or not survive and escape them permanently. Let's put it this way.
It just seems like that's such a ends up being such a brutalist feedback.
So exactly. So if you sooner or later have to expose yourself and deal with your context, how about you start with the context? So that you actually, ideally, there's no majorly painful learning ever, because you're learning quickly enough that when the pain comes, you're ready. I see that coming. I'm no longer exposing myself that way. I'm now either trying something else, or I've seen quickly enough what this pain might be, and I can put my hands up so I'm not hit by a ball, or simple. So, but that all requires that you actually are present in your context. So what I believe this constraint thinking promotes is that you pay attention to your context first, and that you're led by the context. So you can turn it around and say, as I said, often what's the smallest thing that could possibly work in order to learn? Just going and writing an API and see how it starts being used, and see, hey, is there anybody who would use it? But then immediately starting interacting with him, and also say, okay, how do you like it? How do you not like it? Opening up feedback loops might be just as good a starting point as, I'm going to go and dream up, I'll do lots of research and blah, 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 and lots of architectural discussion before you actually start using it. And that might be just as good. So the crucial thing is not where you start, or that might be important, but not crucial. The crucial thing is, are you actually listening to the right feedback? Are you responding? Are you improving your feedback? Another thing, so you often see when people start things, platforms or initiatives, otherwise it's like, we did surveys. The feedback says what we're doing is great. And I always say, if your feedback is just great, you're not asking the right questions, you're not listening to the right signals, you're not paying attention.
You've got, I try to say that sometimes to people, like, feedback without back pressure is not feedback, right? Like, there's got to be back pressure, right? There's got to be, if it's not shaping your behavior in any way, it's not really feedback. It's just information. And information is not necessarily bad, but it's not feedback, right? So I was like, the other thing I was kind of thinking about, I had two other thoughts really quickly, and then we should do kind of practice, some practice stuff based on this. But so the first one was, I was thinking about, like, they're related. So there's this philosopher who's another kind of process philosopher, Simon Donald, and he talks about this idea of transindividuation. And so what his argument is, which I think is, again, it's related to these things, and I want to pull it apart a little bit, because I'm hoping that people don't get this idea that the constraints are out there somewhere and they just have to find them and then they can apply them appropriately, as if, like, they could just go and have them predetermined by someone else and given to them, like the constraint regimes or recipes or something like this. And so what Simondon has this idea that he says most of Western philosophy is stuck in this idea that says that like the way things occur is that there's kind of form and matter. And so form, you should think about kind of Platonic forms like circles and squares and triangles that exist in a completely ideal state and kind of are timeless or atemporal. They exist without ever changing. And so, the argument being that the way things happen is these forms interact with matter and the matter shapes itself to the form. So there's some sort of like pre-existing blueprint to the shapes and things that we see in the world, right?
So, is that in the Platonic sense?
Yeah, in the Platonic sense. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. And you can see this in a lot of Western philosophy. Basically, the function follows form. All of these kind of arguments. You see them in kind of design theory a lot too. And so what Simondon says is that so if you're a process philosopher, you got a couple problems. One is you don't believe in timelessness. There is no atemporal system. There's only temporal systems. So that's a problem if you're a process philosopher. But second of all, there's no matter either. There's like matter is not quite the right way to look at it. So you got two problematic systems interacting with each other. And no wonder people are confused. If you're a process philosopher, you're like, this is clearly going to confuse people. And so what he says is that you need to invert the understanding, which is to say that an individual, like a person or a platform or thing that can be identified and pointed at, that's got its own identity, an individual, you shouldn't have this idea that there was some decision that was made and then like it was filled in by like something. But instead, you get this inversion of that, which is that the form occurs because of the interactions, not other than the interactions, right? It is interaction that causes it. And he gives this idea then that what's happening is what he called trans-individuation. So the way to think about that really quickly is to say, in our constraint regime theory and the way that we're kind of talking about kind of top down and bottom up and things like this is that the platform occurs not just because the platform team does the thing, but that the platform does a thing that changes the development teams, and the development does things that changes the platform. And so they are becoming organs, they're becoming individuated from each other, but they're only individuating in relationship to each other, right? If they were separated, they wouldn't individuate correctly anymore. They would like kind of spin off and become overly atomic, not quite right. So there's this like weird version of they become individual organs by interacting together. They trans-individuate, which I think is closer to like some of the stuff we're interested in when we kind of look at these things. And so that kind of the other version of that I thought was interesting, and to kind of point out a little bit more about how I think about the team stuff. So in Alicia's book, she talks a little bit about her first book, Dynamics. She talks a little about this. She takes an information theoretic view towards language. And in particular, she kind of talks about like, there's a reason why there's 26 letters in the alphabet. And it's partially because there's only a certain number of combinations that you can make. There's a probabilistic set of combinations you can make that basically makes you able to go, I think, even if you've never seen the word before, you can go, that looks like a word. That should be a word, as opposed to that random combination of letters should not be a word, right? There's a certain set of combinations that allow you as a human to kind of go, that seems word-like. So I should figure out what that word is. And you can say the same thing about grammar and sentences, right? Like, certain word structures look like sentences because they satisfy certain constraint regimes. And therefore, even if you don't know what the sentence means, you can go, that is sentence-like, so I should try to figure out what it means, right? So I tried to explain this to my mother the other day, who was a speech path and a psycholinguist. And she was like, oh, that's really interesting. But did you ever think that maybe the other reason that there's 26 letters is because there's only a certain number of sounds that you can make, and so that there's actually So the alphabet is not just an information theoretic; it's actually a physical theoretic as well. Like it's satisfying multiple constraint regimes, both your ability to kind of process information, but also your ability to make certain sounds. And I think that's what I mean by these top-down constraints. Is often what stabilizes, for instance, the alphabet is not simply the information theoretic, but the actual other set of top-down constraints, which is like your ability to say certain things, certain shapes and sounds are available for your mouth to make. Anyway, so.
But that's probably, that's how they constraint regimes. It's both. It's your physical limitations and actually, so what are we actually trying to do when we're talking? And so there are 26 letters in the Latin alphabet, but how is that for some of the African dialects who can, they make sounds that I never learned to make. And so even if I try to make them now, I'm just not going to achieve because I also now physiologically didn't develop the skill at the age that you're still capable of developing. My mother was American. I grew up in Switzerland. I only spoke Swiss German. But when I roughly was like 8, 9 years old, she started teaching me TH. Yeah, because she knew, oh yeah, when he passes 12, he will never be able to do the thing. Yeah. So she made sure. She didn't teach me English. I learned that much later probably. But she made sure I would be able to speak English without sounding like a ridiculous Swiss, although I still do, I think.
But I do think, that's another example of your the way that the system stabilizes around a set of expectations as well, right? Like it's not simply like a physics problem. It is there's a social construct happening there. Like you have an expectation of the types of sounds that you should be able to make, but also that you should be able to hear, right? So again, like another perfect example of this is learning Chinese is difficult for many Americans because they can't hear the intonation. They just literally can't hear the differences between certain words.
For the little tonal difference. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's why it's important. So this is my issue with the bottlenecking of problems is it's multiple constraints interacting in complex ways, not just so TOC's problem is that it actually just teaches where's the most governing constraint. Yeah. And so they say attention is the biggest, or management attention is.
Yes.
What they stop thinking about is, first of all, what other options are there? How can we mitigate that? But also, what are all the contributing factors in a system that has become? So they're just trying to we'll have to maximize the use of management attention instead of actually starting thinking, what kind of organization are we that is the problem?
Yeah.
Because if you talk to somebody who has no experience with management structures, intuitively, what do you think is the biggest problem? Then they would actually say getting things done, not managing things. And when you start telling them, actually managing things is the much bigger problem, you need to explain a lot before they actually. It usually takes people a long time till they even understand that management attention is, in most organizations, the biggest constraint. But the important thing when we talk with the language, and just to make clear, is they are constraint regimes, Don't think when you found one, you understand the problem.
Yeah.
If you start, the good thing about TOC, for example, is, so in my experience, is, you start playing with that constraint. You use TOC to see how we manipulate it. And if you look for feedback loops, then you start to say, there's this other stuff that matters. Yeah. And there's other stuff that matters. And there's other stuff.
Yeah.
When you get toward these chains, value chains, that's what I said. Value stream is a linear view. That's not how it works. You need to look at the whole thing as chains of webs and networks, etc. Then constrained networks is maybe another way how people could understand regimes.
Right. Yep. Yeah.
The regime comes when it stabilizes. Yeah. The stabilization is what makes it a regime.
Yeah, and so I think that one of the things that ends up with theory constraints, which I agree, the naive version is exactly the way you describe it. But one of the things that does come out from Goldratt eventually is he basically argues that because managers cannot grapple with their system as a complex system, they simplify it. And what he means by that is they basically establish rigid context-free constraint systems that make the system unresponsive to dynamic pressures from other parts of the environment, which stabilizes the system and helps them to understand it. But then it means that they become the primary constraint because the thing that will allow the constraints to modify themselves are convincing the executive that they've put the wrong constraints in place, right? So that because they're in control of essentially shaping at least the formal constraint regime, and they're not allowing that constraint regime to emerge bottom up, they're doing it literally top down by force or fiat, that's why they become the constraint in the system.
Yeah. So now we got to what I said. There can also be top-down context-sensitive constraints. So that's what you need to get them to. So, okay, there might have been an emergency or a crisis, which is why consultants like crisis, because it allows you actually to put in top-down context-insensitive constraints. Yeah, it gives you the political power to do that. But okay, they might have been necessary at one point. They might have had the validity at the moment where you understood the problem and you needed to act. How can we now make them context sensitive? Well, start allowing feedback loops. Start the constraint to be formed by the feedback that it receives. And then you get to constraint regimes again. So
and I guess the other thing that I think that this points at, right, is that the top-down version is the one that kind of the top-down constraint regime, the one that we were kind of initially talking about, is the one that would allow for truly autonomous teams to exist. And in fact, bottom-up constraint regimes, the kind of the naturally evolving ones that I think that we're trying to describe, the ones that are kind of more attuned to complexity theory, are actually recognize interdependence as what causes the regime to stabilize.
Yes.
Right. And so it's not about autonomy. It's about understanding and modulating interdependence, not autonomy.
Okay, so I mean, we can go heads on with the people who say team autonomy is important, etc., and we'll lose. Partially because I think the popularity of the team autonomy, this is for self-interest.
Come on, the windmills are fun to tilt at, though. You got to run in a couple of windmills here and there.
But if we take the concept that biological autonomy takes into account, and we might get later to that as well as trust, is how do you negotiate actually what are you autonomous on? What is so autonomy is never free choice, because as I said earlier, the environment sooner or later will kick back. 100%. So there's no perfect autonomy. So then the question is, what do you need to be autonomous on? And as long as the autonomy can be negotiated, so what kind of top-down constraints can you put in that are context sensitive, allowing autonomy to be negotiated? Because equally, I mean, if we take Marquette's push the authority where the competence is, that says, actually delegating autonomy can be very, very powerful and enabling. Can create new stabilization. So the issue is, how do you negotiate the space of the autonomy? So simply said, there has to be alignment, although as we all now know, just go and do a nice vision statement won't do. So the alignment is exactly what closure enables. So top-down context-sensitive constraints, or constraint regimes, probably better than as just a constraint, is what defines the alignment space. And then within that space, be as autonomous as you want. Because you're now where the information arrives. So if you can handle it, if you can react to it in a value-creating way, perfect. We don't need to know.
I mean, we end up again all the way back to this membrane idea, though, right? And this idea of organization and the flow of information through membranes and the flow of materials and skills through membranes, right? And that would be what the managers would be trying to manage, is the placement of productive boundaries or membranes through the organization that allow, as you're describing, certain forms of decision making to be isolated from other forms of decision making, where the information flows in a reasonable way across the networks, and allows those things to happen.
It's always so lovely.
I'll try to bring in the social practice theory by saying this. So we talk about nexuses sometimes, and I want to talk about nexus a little bit, because I think it starts to talk about kind of what you're calling practice mapping or maturity mapping a little bit. And so sometimes what I say to people is, like, if you if you think through this stuff that we've just been saying, and you apply it to organizational development. So, and what I mean by organizational development in this case is I want to adopt some new technology, or I want to do certain things. I want the organization to be capable of doing new things. So I might want to adopt new technology, new practice, something. I want to change something, so I have a new capability in the firm. For instance, in a lot of firms right now, I want to have the capability to architect and operate a platform. That's the capability I'd like to have, right? So the question then would be, well, how do you know what to do, where to focus your development activities? So like what skills and things like this do you develop? And so I think like the very traditional way of doing that is to have a list. You have a list of skills. Like there's a list of like, these are the things you should know. You should know about like whatever, container orchestration. You should know about observability. Like there's a list of things. And you just kind of go down the list of things and say, okay, so we need to develop this list of things, right? And to me, the interesting thing, at least as a starting point for some of this nexus thing, and we'll have to take apart what social practice means eventually, but is to say one of the things we should do is think of the skills as not being individual things. They're not unrelated to each other, but in fact, try to develop an understanding of how those skills are interrelated and how certain skills can retard or accelerate other skills in their development, in their ways of kind of coming to be inside the organization. So like, how far off am I from your understanding of like, at least like, let's start with like nexus and network of practices type stuff.
Okay, I'll get there.
Yep.
So let's backtrack like what over what you said. So because we see this, so an organization wants to do a platform, wants to have, as you said, the capability of architecting and operating a platform. Mm-hmm. So number one, like, are you trying to solve a problem that you otherwise haven't figured out how to solve yet? Or more importantly, you have a solution. You could do it in other ways, but you have actually good reasons to believe that platform is the right vehicle to improve the solution and make it stable and make it sustainable and make it profitable. Yeah. Mm. So if it's the latter, fine. So another issue then is this propensity of recipes. You talked about it earlier. Yeah. So then it goes, oh, who are the successful platform companies? Yeah. What do they do? Can we copy that? Mm. Yeah. Yep. So if we look at it through the lens of practices, I haven't studied this well enough yet. So when I watched Simone's episode, I think I might have to go and look at his platform design kit. Maybe that does that. But I have, for example, a lot of experience with organization trying to accelerate and doing DORA. Yeah. Yep. So they go through the list and they say, oh, we're doing okay, we have now agile teams that do stand-ups, they have backlogs. They have all the things and they still fail miserably. Yeah. Right. The reason they fail miserably, more often than not, is that the list of skills is a proxy. Yeah. So first of all, some of the skills in the list might actually be really useful in their context. But in order to actually figure out which ones they are, the key is the integration. How are these different skills, these different practices actually interconnected? Mm. How are they feedbacking to each other? Yeah. If you want to use a source control system if in your pipeline, but you're actually never looking at how can source control systems in general interacting with the pipeline, you might just, you might pick the wrong one for your context, the one that actually holds you back and makes it painful. Yeah. Mm. You don't look, what are my needs? And then hence now I'm going to look what kind of system I need. Mm. People usually, that's the system Google use. Must be the best source control system. We want to use that. I'm not sure whether people really think about Google for source control system, but just as an example. Yep. But that's how people often think. Like, what they're thinking about is we want the artifacts. And the way people should think about it is, okay, so if I want to build a platform, as I said, the first thing you actually need to understand is your context. What are your problems? What do you know about the problems? Also, I would always argue that your competitive advantage is your your experience surface. You're experiencing, almost every organization sits at a different point, somewhere different in an environment. And because it's all different, everybody has a unique vantage point.
Yep.
And if you want to be competitive, one of the key skills is how can I use my vantage point over my competitors,
right,
to grow and, occupy more space in the environment.
Yep.
So when you want to build a platform, when you have to make all these choices, you need to understand your context.
Yeah.
You need to stand. So when we look at the practices that you need, again, they should relevant. We could use another complexity principle, next adjacent. Snowden, Kaufman, Cilliers, not quite sure who I should attribute for that. But next adjacent is a principle. So where are you and what is next?
Yeah.
So what are you already doing in order to cope with the problem that you have an understanding how to solve, that you hope to improve the solution with the platform? Then, okay, what are the practices that we have? How can they be changed, smallest thing that could possibly work, to get closer to something that then would also satisfy the characteristics of a platform, and then iterate towards that. And you might actually also discover along the way, if you listen to your feedback, that an API will do. You don't need a platform.
Yeah.
Or, so if you're open to, not all platforms have to be platforms, and not everything, that goes out and markets itself as a platform turns out to satisfy the characteristic that most people who deal with platform will recognize as platforms.
Yeah. So again, I think of it sometimes like, I like music metaphors for social practices just because they seem to register in my brain. So for instance, if you wanted to play the blues, right, there would be a list of skills. You'd have to understand the pentatonic scale, 4/4 time, certain rhythms, certain strumming patterns, certain 1/4/5 chord patterns, certain bass note combinations to kind of understand that. But if you had all those skills, on one hand, you wouldn't necessarily be Robert Johnson. On the other hand, Robert Johnson would satisfy most of those constraints, right? So it's just because you have certain constraints in your system doesn't mean you arrive at the best performance possible within that phase space, right? So there's this weird thing, I think, about a lot of practices, or at least the way that we describe practices in Agile communities and some other kind of practice communities, where we say first principles and then practices, right? You have to understand the first principles, you have to understand the practices. And it's yes, you do. Those are two important things. First principles would be why do the pentatonic scales work this way? Blah, blah, blah. Practices in this case would be the ability to play the pentatonic scales and to play in certain times and things like that. But that actually underdetermines whether or not you perform well. You have to be able to perform within those constraints, but it underdetermines whether or not you will still be a good blues player, right? So in fact, there's this additional thing, which is you have to develop good taste. You have to develop the ability to hear what good blues music sounds like. And the weird thing in most organizations is you'll hire an Agile coach and they'll just kind of come in and be you're not playing blues well. You're okay, should I do it more like this? I got just do it more like that. You're okay, so I'm doing it now. Is it good now? I'm it's better. And then they leave, and you're I don't know why. Was this better? Why was this better? And who's going to tell me whether I'm doing it right now? And part of it to me is that the organization never develops a way that the performance can be seen as being skillful or not. They never have a way of other teams going, this is what a skillful performance of this looks like. And so that's another thing that I've always kind of thought about kind of when we look at this maturity mapping stuff that you guys have been playing with, is that there's a set of questions about, no, it's not just what skills do you need? It's about understanding what it would look like if it was being done well. Yeah. And that's not predetermined outside. You can't just hire someone to come in and tell you this is what good looks like. you have to have these performances, and you have to teach people to evaluate the performance themselves. They have to learn to evaluate the performance up for themselves. Yeah.
Okay, so you more or less described the motivation behind also why we called it initially maturity mapping and why we now go to. So essentially, we're changing the name. So we is Chris McDermott, who actually had the initial idea of the device by which we got to a thing that is called maturity map. But that was exactly the point that we said. So it was a linguistic trick, so to speak, because people often encounter. So they are presented with, here's a maturity model, how you should be like, here's a platform maturity model, Gartner or blah, blah. And we said this stuff, or a maturity model to be agile, like modern agile. Yeah. All of these things are prerequisites. Yeah. And we said, no, that's not how, when Practice Lens says that too, that's not how practice works. Yeah. So you can't import, that's why I call it maturity mapping. We say, hey, you have a map. If anybody ever comes in and says, here's a maturity model that somebody made outside of the organization up, and you should follow this. That's, hey, how does that compare to this maturity model that we created ourselves, in which we learned how we evaluate what good looks like, because we're constantly asking the question as one of the key things that we're doing in maturity mapping when we talk to people. How are your practices integrated, and how do you think you're going to do with the practice? Even if people actually don't know, even for practices. So for some practices, you have the difficulty that there are books and videos and TED Talks and blah, blah, that tells you this is what Agile looks like. And if you're not doing this, you're not Agile. Yeah. Who cares?
Yep.
What is important about being Agile is that you learn, that you adapt, and that you make, the system of work for you. Yeah. That is one of the key. And I would argue you're Agile if you can do this at a high cadence. Yeah. So you respond to changes in your context quickly because you have now developed the right kind of feedback loops, sensorium, instruments, whatever you want to call it, to experience this. But just going quickly to your blues model, I don't know how we can measure this, but I would say probably the best blues musicians don't know half of the theory that you just listed. Sure. They have no concept of it. Yep. The reason they do it, is because all this theory is us trying to explain what happened.
Yep.
It's rationalizations after the experience.
Yep.
The experience is key. Really good artists, what makes them good artists is that they have a sensorium for experiences that other people don't see, don't experience, don't feel, They have a sensibility for what the situation affords. Yep. And they can go there, and then they have the feedback. Oh, other people like this. Yeah, I'll do more of that. Yeah. Yep. Oh, that seems to get me. That keeps people listening. I'll do more of that. Yep. Or, hey, I'm hearing something in what this guy does, and they're all listening. I'll try my version of it. Oh yeah, now they're listening. No, they're not listening. I'll change a little bit how I do it. Yeah. It is this interaction. So the same thing with maturity mapping is what we actually first of all do with people is we go and we create their practice network. So what are the things that you're actually doing in order to achieve your outcomes?
Yep.
In that regard, it's not unlike maybe you taught me service blueprinting by Lucy Kimball.
Yep.
Yeah. It's not dissimilar actually. We do a bit more of a visually complex version than she does, but in principle, what she actually says is, okay, so here's how you currently satisfy your user journey.
Yep.
Okay, let's see what actually happens here. Front stage, backstage. Yeah, who's participating? What things need to be in place in order for this to happen? Yep. And where are the pain points of this? And then you can start thinking about what can we change to alleviate some of these pain points.
Right.
So,
yep.
You've talked about product thinking. Whenever I hear people talk about product management, I think that's the one thing they should start with. Yeah, start thinking about how people currently deal with a problem.
Sure.
Where are the pain points, and what options does maybe technology, but also maybe just changing processes to give us to alleviate some of these pain points. Then let's make a hypothesis in terms of let's create a blueprint of what we think it could look like and talk that through with stakeholders. The other thing you often talk about is don't design for, don't develop for, with stakeholders, with your users. And that means even in the design stage, and when you think about doing something, talk it through with your stakeholders. So we think about changing this to this and this. How would that change your participation in it?
Yep.
If you think about it from a practice lens, that's almost a natural way of looking at it.
Yep.
Because from a practice theory point of view, you immediately start to, okay, so I change this user journey represents some of the, let's say, product team practices, and the artifacts like whatever digital tangible thing is produced to interact with.
Yeah.
And naturally, they would think about, so how do these practices interact with the practices of stakeholders and users?
Mm.
And so equally, if we do maps, we just distill this initially in a set of practices.
Yep.
When we work with teams, what we also realize is often teams actually have a concept internally already of these practice networks. They just never thought about it through the lens of practice.
Right.
And unless they're really dysfunctional, what they're doing internally is not that important. It's often, it's an interesting, it might be an interesting experience for them to map and start getting them thinking about practice theory. But where it really starts to matter is what you call, or others, you may be aware of this term, boundary practices.
Sure. Yep.
Is actually, where do we have practices close to a platform, that
that's right.
membrane, that interact with other outside team parts of the organization or customer base or the environment, regulatory, legalese, but that's interacting with your environment. And so if we start, that's usually where most of the problems come, because you have the wrong constraints. They're constraints at play that literally disable you. Governing constraints can just constrict you to the effect that you can't be productive, that you can't be profitable, or that you can't be whatever needs to actually be flourishing. And so what we're doing with our work in practice mapping is actually that we try to help visualize and focus on which of these practice interactions, if we would change them, would have the most enabling effect on the rest of the organization, because this is then the leverage point. If you actually find the right practices, it can have like a ripple effect. So you start undoing the bad constraints that are mainly held in place between 3-4 practices, and you start improving the constraint regimes around them, or that they constitute, then suddenly other practices around can change, and change in a positive. So it can be a positive ripple effect, but even if that isn't the case, because you're now looking at it this way, you will be prepared. Okay, we're changing these practices. They're connected to these other practices. Okay, at least when we start changing them, let's pay attention to these other practices, and don't wait, because usually sooner or later we will learn that we impacted other practices. That's when people come either suddenly with what Mario called the school of no. Like, the way you're changing your practices just cause always pain on my side, so I'm just going to come with a really strong regime of caps, or change,
wall of confusion,
boards, walls of confusion go up. That is because there was too much pain when we when we were more free and more independent and autonomous and blah, there was too much pain. So why do we have silos then? If you go back to the history of slow and blah blah blah, that a lot had to do, how do I protect practitioners from bad experiences? How do I promote the good experience? Oh, we put them inside a silo, but then the silo wall became the wall of confusion or the wall of no. And another aspect, just we said we're going to talk about it, is also how that helps with shifting left. Which is the other modern popular thing. So once you understand your practice network and you start actually paying attention to how practices interact and how you change affects other practices, shifting left also has to be rethought a little. And I know this is not just practice people who would start thinking that way. So Michael Bolton has this phrase that he used for a talk that says, when you shift left, be aware of the squirting right. So what he saw, Michael Bolton is a world-leading tester, thinker about testing, and has often seen, we shift left the testing. But testing is a real skill job. So good testers are highly skilled people, should be regarded as highly skilled as architects. And, they understand a lot about how to ensure actually that you understand the quality of the thing that you build. And they understand quality, not just in the purely, does it adhere to the functional spec, but actually how will it fit into the environment and how will the environment react to it? And so when you try to shift left your testing, ignorant actually of the depth of the practices that you're trying to shift left, what happens is you trivialize the practices. Automation is the ultimate trivialization of testing. I'm not saying automation isn't good, but once you understand the practices, you can actually make a conscious decision, say these aspects of the practice, they can be automated. But these other aspects of practices we have to make sure they still happen. Yeah. So, and that is what you see what good testers do.
Yeah.
They will say, oh yeah, here's a bunch of things we can automate, and that will take some of the mundane stuff that we would need to otherwise do as manual testers out of our scope. But only in order now to pay attention to all these things that we usually almost don't have time to pay attention to. And from a practice perspective, that is relatively, so once you understand the practice in your context, how it's currently working, you want to change, it makes it a lot easier to actually have these conversations and also to make the decisions. What are we shifting left and what are we keeping solidly in place in the middle? That might be shrinking then also in its, blockage or whatever people experience at, waiting for a person, because we made this conscious decision, because we're more aware of how we make these choices.
Yeah. So, like, I mean, in relationship to the shift left thing and some of the other stuff we were talking about, because I think it's related to, at least in my mind, right? So we're talking about like blues, and we're talking about like whether blues players start with theory or if we apply theory to what blues players were doing. And how they would develop it without necessarily having theory, so that that they would be able to perform for people. And so, like, one of the things that I tend to think about, again, in this evolutionary kind of bottom up, top down constraint regime development concept, is you have to, like, part of becoming a good blues player would be being perceived as being competent enough to be involved in a feedback loop. In other words, like, if you can't play well enough at all, you can't get anybody to listen to you, right? You can't get on a stage. You can't create the opportunity to have these kind of experiences where you could develop novel practice, right? Where you could develop new ways of thinking or hearing. And so there's like two versions of that in my mind. One is teams and individuals developing the ability to observe what good competence is, so that they can attempt to perform that competence for other people, not for themselves, but for others, so that someone can say, oh yeah, I like that thing that you're doing or not, so that you can have that closure that you're talking about. Because otherwise, like, the feedback loop isn't just like you have to force an audience to exist. The feedback loop is that you have to be competent enough to have an audience, right? And again, this is to me like that part of what I mean by like developing a platform as being kind of like a closure between the platform team and the development teams. Good platform teams essentially perform well enough to get an audience of development teams to tell them if they like the performance or not, right? And that seems to be missing if we take kind of a more technocratic version of it, right? Like that we just have to go and make the right kind of API, or we've got to adopt the right set of tools or things like that. And so I like that, and I think ends up getting us a little bit more into like the way in which social practice kind of differentiates the materiality, the skills, and the meaning of a practice. And that we can't kind of focus on just one. It can't just be the physical manifestation of the tools or the existence of the certain technocratic platforms or processes. It has to be, those things have to be skillfully used by someone to help someone achieve something meaningful in their work. And then also, like, I think the thing that I love that you kind of pointed out a little bit in there was one of the beautiful things about social practice theory to me is that you weren't necessarily taught the practice explicitly. Like, sometimes I say to people like, who taught you how to shower well? Right? Did you go to showering class? Was there a showering workshop that you went to? No, like, you kind of like learned by like understanding how other people looked after they came out and how they were groomed, and then you wanted to groom yourself like that. And like but that's kind of like a diffuse set of observable qualities that you wanted to achieve. It wasn't like someone made a list and you went down and checked off the list. I think, maybe other people had different showering experiences than I did. But the result of that is that, like, some of what we call social practice is not explicit. It's not this kind of like rote task. It's this performative system, right? And so, just really quickly for other people who haven't enjoyed our past conversations about this, one of the things that you and I tend to talk about is fried eggs, right? Like, so again, the materials involved in fried eggs, both in your home and in my home, include pans and eggs and stoves and heat and timers and like this, and basically the same set of tools, right? Like maybe some subtle variations, like I might use a cast iron pan, you might use an aluminum pan, like all sorts of different kind of subtleties, but like roughly the same materiality. But when you first came to my house and I made you fried eggs, you were watching me make fried eggs, and you literally in the middle of it were like, could you explain what you're doing right now? Because, the fried eggs that we eat in your home are the scrambled eggs, is I think what we called them when we were, it was this European almost like custard egg, right? Like it's a smooth custardy thing. Whereas I was making fried scrambled eggs, which are like the kernels are quite hard and often quite large. And so again, the performance revealed something about the practice that was not explicit when I asked you, would you like scrambled eggs? You said yes. What you received was not what you expected, even though I thought I had successfully, skillfully performed the act, right? So again, I think there's just these interesting versions of like, how do we create the ability for people to perform for other people and get feedback on their competence? And how does that, like, again, this boundary observation that you're pointing out, like, what is meaningful about me skillfully performing this boundary practice for you? Like, it may not, like, the meaning for me may be different than the meaning for you, but I need to understand what's meaningful for you in order for it to like close, in order for it to cross these boundaries or something like that. So I don't know. I think there's some interesting stuff to poke around in there.
So you pointed out quickly in there, almost camouflaged. So the definition of a social practice is that it's meaning, material, and competences they talk about. But let's use skill. It works just as well. And I noticed even some famous practice theoretician uses skill more often than competence when he talks about these things. So it's the integration. Yeah. So how you very nicely once articulated, a practice is the application of skills with and to material in order to achieve an outcome, meaning, purpose, etc. Yeah. So so there's material, there's know-how. So when we talk about a performance, then the competence obviously matters. Yeah. When it comes to lists or bills of materials about these kind of things, often what we're invoking is this idea of a recipe.
Yeah.
And I would argue, so I did actually have that discussions with a trained chef who also is interested in old recipes, etc. That originally the recipe is like the things that help you remember what you observed or what you learned from another. So when you learned how to make an omelette or a scrambled eggs, etc. So when I saw you making if we would have written down a 6-step recipe how we make scrambled eggs, it probably would have maybe deviated in 1 point slightly. Yeah. Everything else would have been the same.
That's right. Yeah.
Yet, first of all, when you made scrambled eggs, I've never seen that technique before. I did not recognize it as scrambled eggs, but when I ate it, I did recognize scrambled eggs. Yeah. I said, even though it looks different, you make it different. Yeah. I get quite a lot of the quality that I'm looking for when I eat a scramble, make my own scrambled eggs. And you might be amused to know, my wife starts suddenly to like actually these kind of scrambled eggs more than the European one. So as the gooiness is actually something that she says, make it drier, make it drier, make it drier. That's I think, that's more like, I'm getting more like what Jabe does. Yeah. Right. Yep. I don't know if that because she lived 15 years in Canada or something. Yeah. Maybe also tastes change over time. Yep. But so the important thing is that we're often especially in technology, and there's this power that came when there was a patent book, object-oriented programming that
Yep.
had huge impact. Now, what recipes help you with is like at least start to make sense in the chaos of options. Yeah. Is it here are some things that might get you started. If you treat it in a way as even for a platform, so it's not wrong that you say, okay, I don't have the time to learn everything from Adam and Eve. Who's close to roughly what I have in mind? Okay, what are they to getting an orientation, or what is there? Can I see a recipe, a pattern, or something that I can copy or start with? That's okay. Yeah, when we go and teach Team Agile, we initially, okay, I don't often do Scrum anymore, but if you take the Scrum guide, it takes you a bunch of ceremonies. Yeah. Each of the ceremonies has a point. Yeah, there's a purpose while you do it. There's a meaning while you integrate your board with the. I'm moving now from how I'm reading the board. I'm facilitating left to right, right to left, different meaning, etc. But there's reasons why I'm doing these things, and it's at least at one point said in the Scrum guide. If in 6 months you still do everything by the book, you're not doing Scrum. Yeah, because the idea is just we show you some recipe to get you started, but then listen to your context and evolve these practices so that they change and get you more value. So same thing with a blues player. Yeah. So yes, initially maybe to start doing blues, a little bit of, okay, how does that work? Okay, so here's some rhythmic rules. Here are some harmonic rules. I follow them. But if you have a sensorium to listen to the feedback and know how to integrate the feedback in how you change your performance, you probably need far less recipe and patterns and blah, blah, blah knowledge than if you never listen to feedback. And then I would argue you probably will have experienced performances of musicians who can reproduce the theory perfectly, but have very little sensorium for feedback and context. What is it? Wouldn't. And we might admire the artistry. How quickly can they do the scales and blah? Look how fast it's on the guitar. Yeah, but I mean, I saw these. This occurred to me in the phase when I was still really deeply immersed in music. There was this concert, and there were 3 American, and I can't remember all the names, like star guitarists. Oh, these are the best guitarists of the time. There came this guy, and he was a gypsy, and I bet he didn't know any theory. But first of all, actually, his virtuosity, I mean, if you analyze, he probably wasn't faster than the Americans, yeah? But his virtuosity was far more developed. He was following the flow of the music far better, so everyone was blown away, yeah? So he far had less, certifiable competence.
Yeah.
But he had competence in how does playing a guitar in a musical arrangement fit into an environment where there's an audience and people responding to it.
Right. Yeah.
His competence was like, how does it fit in?
Yeah.
How does being in the world? Yeah.
Totally.
He had more competence as that. And the issue with the patterns is that they distract us from that. Yeah.
Yep.
It's also scary. As an ex-performer, I can tell you, it's bloody scary going out there and saying, I'm trusting my being in the world to figure out what good looks like. Yeah, it's much easier to say, hey, here's my, look, 25 Agile certificates.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter whether my working with a team is successful or not in the eyes of the team.
Yeah.
It wasn't me if it failed.
Yep.
I have 25 certificates. So, again, this is where practice theory then helps. It helps us. You start looking at these as things as practices. Practices have to be guided, fit into the environment, and evolve with the environment, with the change in the context that you experience. And the interaction by you doing things in the environment, how you change the context.
Yeah. This is like, one of the things I've been thinking about listening to you talk, kind of like another kind of metaphor, right? Like, so like drum machines initially, like for instance, if you were in a blues band and you had a drum machine, almost certainly it would sound incorrect. Like it wouldn't feel right. It wouldn't like swing the right way. It wouldn't or jazz. Like you can't do jazz drumming on a drum machine. I mean, maybe if you were an incredible programmer, you could figure that out. But in general, like drum machines are not used for these things. And initially, when you heard drum machines used in rock and blues and stuff like this, it felt odd or weird, or they were augmenting a human drummer on the side or something like that to kind of, camouflage it or something like that. But that doesn't mean that drum machines aren't incredibly popular. In fact, techno and a lot of dance music takes the constraints of a drum machine applies them to an environment where, again, what you're talking about is that the artist learns how to work within the constraints of a drum machine, the automated music, to create an appropriate response from an audience, to get them to do certain behaviors, to entrain them on certain rhythms, to get them to dance and do silly things. So it's not that the constraints were inappropriate, it's that the people weren't kind of initially listening. They were trying to reproduce previous practices with the new technology, as opposed to saying, no, this new material thing, this new set of constraints, this new constraint regime, we're going to have to relearn how to use it. And it will actually produce an entirely different way of making music that you couldn't have known about prior to this. It's just not a thing that would have worked. And I mean, I think there's interesting kind of like what happens with it. Like you start bringing in kind of drones and other kind of drone type things from other musical sources to kind of get the kind of automated, repetitive kind of, trance like music that you hear in these places. But anyway, I just think there's something in there to say, like, again, when you apply automation to a system, it requires relearning the practice. It doesn't require transcribing the practice into a new medium, right? Like, it's not just that. It's like literally you have to learn how to perform automation well to a certain extent.
So you saw that also in the evolution of drum computers, and how, for example, so this tension that then came from the initial rigidity of the drum computers, how that also influenced software, so music software development. So I remember the first drum computer, so the first drum computers were these rhythm machines that you have with electric organs. So that was my first experience of a drum machine. Yep. And they were super rigid, and I always hated them because they don't have any human feel. But then relatively soon, when drum machines became a thing, a standalone thing, not just something that you pack into an electric organ, they suddenly would have things like feel or swing, or to start bringing the human thing in. But equally, then, as he's actually said, the interactions of musicians and drum machine constraints also birthed new music styles, new rhythmic styles. Yep. So if you listen to drummers pre-drum machines, one of the things you will see is actually they weren't that bothered about being on the grid, like, always sucking on. And then drum machine came along, and then, for example, we got like jungle music where they had the super fast drum machines, and people would say like, yeah, but no drummer can ever play that. And now you have Lewis Cole, who sounds better than any drum machine ever, but is like on the grid, like. People like myself can't imagine how you ever get that good. I heard he slept 6 months with a metronome under his pillow. That's what he says in the video. But it is the interaction with the material and the experience, but also always important. It's always how musicians use these materials that also drove the development of the materials forward. Yeah. If drum machines would have never evolved from electric organs, they would have never made it into bands, because they were around for 10, 15 years at least. Like, I saw them when I was a little kid. Yep. Drum machines, I was in my 20s or something. Now I'm giving away my age, but when they started to come along. No respectable band ever played to the drum machine and an electric organ on a stage. Yeah, sure. Yep. You only saw this the sole entertainer. Yeah, it's better than have absolutely no percussion. Right. When you have to entertain a bunch of people in a holiday resort for 6 hours every evening. Yeah, then every now and then it adds something. But that's about the limitation of the machine. Yep. Everything else is actually the interactions with musicians and the changing of the machines to accommodate what musicians are trying to do with them.
Yeah, totally.
So when we apply this back to platforms, so then the interesting thing from a practice perspective, we can maybe still squeeze that other topic in, is how practice actually interacts with material. So first of all, here's the assumption that actually material is something that is reproduced by practices. Yep. So I always say, like, infrastructure is not like the universe. It's not like don't treat it like the 5 laws of physics or 4, or what they're down to now. I have lost count at one point. at least the material work within IT. Let's leave the philosophy for the rest of the world out of this discussion. But they're definitely they are condensates out of practices that people do. And as I said recently on Twitter, also all machines die when there's no more practices that maintain them and use them around.
That's right.
As I have no worry that there is an AI that will perpetually be smart and have a notion of killing us, because if it gets smart enough, it knows, oh, I'm built by humans. I have flaws. And I probably have no sensitivity to detect these flaws. So if there aren't any humans around, those flaws will kill me. Yeah. If it's really self-conscious and world, that's the first thing it will realize. Like we realize relatively we're mortal. If we do shit, hey, I'm bleeding. It's hurting. Yeah. If it has any kind of self-conscious, the first thing the machine will know, I'm built by humans. They can't make perfect. Everything they do will mistakes. So I'm not too worried about that.
Yeah.
I'm just quickly, so the whole AI discussion, what I'm worried about is like, it already does all these damages, misogyny, racist, blah, blah, blah. We're not talking about that.
Yeah.
It's all this omni power of AI. This is just a distraction for material and financial and power reasons.
Yep.
So when we go back to the platform, the thing that we're building, which is the quote you used, is not the thing.
Yeah.
The platform is this whole site nexus of practices on both sides of the membrane, the one that constitute, reproduce, and evolve the practices in concert with the consumers.
Yeah. Like
the jazz player is only a blues player is only a great blues player only ever gets the time and the economy to allow to become a good blues player if there's enough blues listeners who say, I like how you're playing. I'll give you money that you can buy food and shelter and serve your other needs, and we don't want you to do anything else. Get better at blues playing, because it's this interaction that enables that.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And that's how you actually get to novel kind of musical performance, musical genre. And again, at least in my mind, there is this weird, there's this weird difference between pure commodity infrastructure, right? Like CPU, storage, compute, things like this that are universally used by any computational system, right? These primitives are just everywhere. And a platform which begins to say things like, no, this is how you play blues versus techno, and we have a techno platform in our organization. We have a blues platform, all the same stuff, same, it's a grid, it's a certain number of sounds. It sounds like drums, whether or not it sounds like acoustic drums or not, but the components, the raw components for most of these musical formats that we hear everywhere, roughly the same. But the platform, the way in which they're combined in certain ways to enable the performance of particular songs, particular products, on top of them, that's what the platform is, right? And again, the individual performance then feeds back into the configuration of the platform. It asks the platform to develop certain competencies so it can play more like this type of music or more like that type of music, and not just like more because I heard someone else to play it in a certain way, not just because I've heard someone else perform something, but because I've performed something that pushed the edge of something in the platform, and I want to push beyond that. So I need the platform to adapt so I can see kind of beyond that horizon in order to create these novel things. And that to me is this, again, like you're saying, it's the way that there's a membrane that allows those things to occur, but also like is adaptive in both directions. It's not just a one-way thing. It's not just, it's not just that we're not just developing a drum machine experience for people who want to play techno. That's not all we're doing, right? We're not just trying to lower the cognitive load of how to program a drum machine. That's not the only thing we're doing, right? Like there are multiple different valid drum machines you can buy these days. drum machine platforms, like Electron has one, and there's kind of modular systems that do different type of drumming and things like this. Why do they exist? Well, they exist because they enable different types of performances, different types of exploration, and they simplify certain things while making other things much more enriched or difficult or thoughtful
diverse,
or whatever. So the constraint regimes aren't simply about like, there's sometimes like it's this progressive thing that I get worried about, right? Where people hear like we talk about constraint regimes and stuff like this, and like they think that we're like going to eventually converge on a set of constraints that will serve a maximum amount of goodness, right? And that's not really what I think is happening, at least on the platform level. In fact, we're creating a set of constraints that are temporarily responsive to a certain number of performances, certain number of products. And as those products change what they need to perform, the platform needs to constantly adapt. So it never quite converges totally. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, also so I never talk about constraint regimes in my work because the intuitive understanding of people about to use the word constraint, they think, oh, I'm going to constraint, and regime is like, I'm going to dictate. So the word might be too problematic. So first of all, don't do that until, so we're geeking here out on our favorite expertises, etc. And it was, for people who are interested in this, it was important to explain these things. But yes, you're absolutely right. So also, if we look how constraint regimes work in nature, then usually what their effect is like they're stabilizing in something somewhere by which enable new things.
Yep.
As soon as these new things don't have the ability anymore to mediate these constraint regimes, you're getting a rigidity and then you get into death. In nature, you don't change, you die. Yeah.
Yep.
Very, very simple.
Yep.
You don't change. The context will change around you. That's inevitable. Nothing is stable forever, etc. So the ability to respond to context is probably the most important attribute. So equally, if you have a platform, so when you were talking about CPU and storage and blah, blah, so this is the important thing. These things cost money.
Yep.
So yeah, you should care. That's what I said about the ivory tower API architect. You need to care about some of these things.
Yep.
So to a certain extent, the membrane is here to protect that some of these precious, expensive resources aren't overused. So.
Yep.
But equally, if the overuse is so constraining, and that's what your three economies explains, you actually never get to the benefits of the platform because people might say, oh, this is great. And as soon as we want more of that, you can't have it because you can't pay for it. Yeah, it's exhausting our resources. So it's exactly how can we enable the good stuff without exhausting what we have underneath, which is a key problem we also have to figure out as a civilization because we're not figuring out. And what does Latour told us? We're now currently consuming 2.5 planets. So we're literally eating our existence away.
That's right. Yeah.
If we don't learn how to actually mediate this interaction in a sustainable way, we're not going to learn it. And who knows, maybe we'll learn something from platforms that we can then apply globally, which is why am I working in organizations? Is with Maslow, who never did a pyramid, said, when he worked with organizations, oh, look, we can learn things about society at a much quicker scale than in society itself within organizations. Yep. Same, we can learn maybe how we differentiate and abstract and create layers of protection membranes between certain layers of materiality, practices, etc., by building platforms, which is, now you can go and watch Simone Cicero's ideas about the future of, when I heard him talking, that sounded slightly utopian to me, but look at us, I just talked myself into his view of thinking about how the future maybe could look like.
You have to come back and talk to me about trust next time. We'll do a whole episode on trust soon, and especially I think we've done a lot this episode kind of about development but it would be interesting to talk through these same ideas from kind of like an adoption perspective, how to work with other people, developing trust. But also, like, I feel like so much of platforming is there's this missing conversation about governance, which, I try to bring in from like a commons perspective and things like that. But like, how do we, like, what is this, we talked about it a little bit, like we kind of got there around like, where does the decision making go? How do we shape the decision making? But I think there's a whole conversation that needs to be had more around governance, where governance becomes, where do the boundaries go? What can cross across the boundaries effectively? Who manages the boundaries? And in socio-technical systems theory, boundary roles for establishing these boundary practices and stuff like that. So I think that'd be fun to have you come back and talk about that. But for this episode, what are like 3 things that you think people should take away from the conversation? Something they can do something with, or something they can research more, or just the things that you think are most important to kind of think about coming out of our conversation.
Okay, so you did tell me you're going to ask me for 3 things. I prepared 3 things, but you didn't ask the question quite the way. So if they want to learn more about practice theory, it's a difficult one. I would start with the book, The Everyday Life of... No, it's not. Mm-hmm. That's embarrassing. It's a book by Elizabeth Shove about the dynamic of practices, I think, or the dynamic of social practices. Maybe there's a book you told me to read initially, so you should remember. But so Elizabeth Shove, Ted Shatsky are some of the names that might be useful for people. There are some videos, but I'm afraid these are academics and the real juicy bits are in their books, but they write very accessible books. They're not hard to, you don't need to be an academic to understand. I'm not an academic, and I understood them. Although, yeah, I do maybe sometimes now sound like one. I'm sorry about that if that's true.
Hey, now I'm an academic.
Well, you want to be. You want to be. You're working on it. Yes. Did you do 1,000 words today? So the first thing of the 3 things is context. Yeah. So I made a plug earlier for Alicia's book. The title is "Context Changes Everything."
Yeah.
And first of all, this is true, but also this is, if you're not in any way, so Wordly talks about situational awareness. It said what that means is, and this is why wordly mapping is helpful, is it helps people to visualize context. Yeah. So one of the differences, so maturity mapping builds on the mapping technique of Wordly. And so if you want to talk to us, bring me up on Twitter, on some sheep, because the contextualized website is crap. We just don't have time to do this, and nobody seems to be interested in it. In our website, or us, there's a site called maturitymapping.com where you can have some of the ideas how we're applied, but most of the content is a bit outdated because we keep doing it rather than go and advertise what we're doing, because the doing is so much more interesting. But the first thing is context. Yeah, context. Learn how to create sensibility for the right parts also of your context. So figure out, where do I need to have sensibility to feel the context, to respond to context. And agile to me means like the ability to respond to context. The second thing people should take away is, as you build your platform, this is not a technology project. Yeah. This is a social project.
Yeah.
So you have to see it as from the perspective of organization, and the organization, the form of organizing how your customers organize around your organization. So the way you would say this is, when you do designing, planning, etc., do it with your stakeholders, do it with your users. For product management, designing with users is almost, UX, UR, etc. That's what it gets down to. But we don't do this I heard this in a previous podcast. It's like, when you design your platform, understand that your operators, your security people, well, these are also your users. Yeah, treat them like users. Spend the same time of learning how you need to design your platform with them than with your users. Because if it's not easy to operate, it's not going to make you any money, and it's sooner or later go. So work with you. So if you understand the world as a stakeholder network, like stakeholder theory does, then what we mean by stakeholders are all the people that have a stake in this thing, in this nexus of practices. And so you need to understand all their practices. Why are they stakeholders? They have practices that will interact with your platform. Understand these practices. Work with them so you can also integrate the practices that maintain the platform with their practices so that you get the most value from your platform. And if it's a third thing, it's a very old thing that I learned a long time ago. When you have a plan, you want to do something, you want to get something done, make it easy for people to say no to you. And give them options to understand why you want to do something and what is your need, so they can point out other ways for you to satisfy the need. Because if you make it difficult for people to say no to you, you will find out sooner or later that you're wrong, but it's going to be painful.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that like that last one is a point that we poked at a couple times in this conversation that I think is critical, which is this, like, if you make your I want to like think of it almost like insulin resistance, if that makes any sense. If you teach your platform team to be immune to certain forms of feedback, it will only respond to certain other forms of feedback, and those tend to be much more brutalist, like you're running out of money, or the VP of software development is telling every team not to use your thing anymore, right? What you want to be doing, of course, is trying to figure out how to develop a system that responds more sensitively to the signaling that it's getting, so that you're, again, lowering your insulin resistance, so that you are more appropriately responding to your environment. And I think that that's is definitely a critical concept that I take away from the conversation. That I liked a lot. If people want to support your work, Marc, and find out more about you, where should they look, or what type of things would you point them at?
Come and hire me, or hire me and Chris, or you don't necessarily have to hire us. So we both have jobs most of the time. We're busy. It's not easy to actually. It will not be that easy to get our time. But come and talk to us. So the reason I say hire is, like, we might charge you a little bit for it, because we spend an awful lot of blood and tears into learning these things, and a lot of these things the hard way. But come and talk to us. We're always really keen to talk to people about their experiences and how we can help them. What is called the practice lens, tangible and working in their environment. Just very quickly need to say this. One of the reasons I love the practice lens is because it removes the necessity for people to learn complex theory and understand complex theory, because even though they're very adjacent, you'll be surprised that they don't, in practice theory, they don't talk about complexity. And I think it has a lot. I've never explored this, and I should, maybe, now that I have a bit of a network. But my guess is it's the complexity articulation from a certain school that has Santa in its first part of the name, which has a very different articulation of complexity than you get from Militia Huero. My guess is the reason you never read about complexity in practice theory is because there are aspects of complexity theory that don't say what we talked about tonight, and we wouldn't quite support everything we advocated for. But so practice theory. So I would, Chris and I will be delighted if we would start in IT. People actually start embracing the view of practice, the practice lens, and we're happy to help with that. It doesn't take us to hire us for like 6 months to make that happen. A few hours here and there, conversations might actually do the trick. Rather than going and learning 200 patterns, and just like, oh, what did they say in the book? Did I do what they say in the book? No, just start looking at the world through this lens, and you will start to see things different. But maturitymapping.com is at least where the beginnings of our ideas are documented. As I said, all the content is now 2 years old, given we're doing this maybe 4 now. You can imagine how up to date it is.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I mean, I love that. Love that idea of getting more people to have these conversations, and to make some of the complexity theory tractable, right? Like there's 2 things that I tend to like, that I worry about when Alicia announced the name of her book, right? I just could hear all these consultants across the world being like, "See, it depends," and I was right. It depends, and I'm like, right. But that's not actionable. That's not what we're trying to get to. The same thing with complexity. Is just like there are ways of making these things practical and to make progress with them, and it's not simply an excuse to be like, we can't know anything, we can't do anything about these things. We just, again, like, as you're saying, we need a different lens to make progress sometimes. So
do consultants really say that? It depends. Why would you need consultants if it depends?
That's right.
Who knows better what those dependencies are than you in your context?
Absolutely.
But I mean, the issue about the book is that it tells you how dependencies actually work in a constitutive way. Yeah.
Yep.
Not in a, hey, I'm free now to interpret any of these rules any way I like because it depends.
Right. Or because it depends, I'm going to just terraform your company into the form that I know works, as opposed to trying to help you move from where you are. Right. So.
Yeah, and I know how it works without actually really having immersed myself in your context.
That's right. I'm just going to make you. I'm going to make you into my most recent McDonald's kitchen because I know how McDonald's kitchens work.
The thing that I heard consultants say is like, I can't stay longer than 6 months because I'm getting pickled.
Yeah, exactly.
What we mean by pickled is, now you actually start to develop a sensibility to the contextual things here.
Yep.
Your recipes might no longer work without contextualization.
Yep. Cool. All right, Mark. Again, you come back and talk to me about trust. It's a conversation. I keep on promising to finish this conversation, or not finish, but like reopen it with you. I think
we keep saying we have to have that conversation, but it will be at least 2 hours. I promise you. It's a much more complex issue than platforms.
Excellent. So you'll come back and we'll talk about that in the future. It was so nice to have you.
Thank you for having me, and thank you anybody who have the patience and the interest to keep on that long.
Cool. All right, Mark. Thanks. I'll see you soon, man. Talk soon.
Good night.
Good night.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. It's almost.
Yes.